Welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show we have Dennis Hursh. He is a physician contract lawyer and he wrote the Kevin MD article, Are Hospitals Evil? A Physician Contract Lawyer Explains. Dennis, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I think one of the questions you were talking about is my story. And the reason I sort of got into this was about 31 years ago. My first child was born, and she had DeGeorge syndrome and everything that goes with it, truncus arteriosus, neurology issues. So we spent probably most of the first year of her life in the hospital. And that's when I really got to know physicians other than people with white coats who run in and out. And in particular, one night, the cardiac care fellow and the intensive care fellow spent all night at her bed, and the worried looks, and the cardiac fellow apologized because he had to get, as he put it, sustenance. And he came back in 10 minutes with a small salad. And that really impressed me that the physician had to apologize because physicians eat too. So based on that, there's just, how do you thank somebody for that? They brought her through. We've had a lot of other incidents since then, but she's a healthy person now. And how do you thank them? I mean, I wrote a letter to the hospital, wrote a letter to them, wrote a letter to the hospital CEO. And eventually I ended up just forming what I think is the first law firm in the country that just focuses on physician employment agreements. And I also wrote a book on physician employment agreements. So that's kind of how I came to be involved with physicians.
So even after all these years, I still get a lot of questions from physicians about whether they should have a physician contract lawyer review their agreement prior to signing. And we have these questions all the time on physician-only Facebook groups. So tell my audience, why is it important for physicians to obtain some legal counsel during the contract process?
Well, I think, first of all, you hear that this is our standard contract. And literally there's one region of one health system in the country that won't change its contracts that I've run into. And once or twice in the 30 years I've been doing this, I've had a hospital refuse to change a contract. Generally, they will change it. And you just have to have some kind of reasonable standard in there. Patient contact hours. And again, I'm not saying that because it's good for you as a physician. I kind of worry if I'm seeing a physician that's doing 40 patient contact hours a week, call 3 days a week, and then maybe another 20 hours a week working on medical health records to keep them polished up. So I think it's very important that you look at things like patient contact hours, call coverage. They may not be able to guarantee something, but most places I have gotten them to say it won't be more than this. And if they have to buy a locum tenens, hire a locum tenens to come in and do it, then do it. But I really believe that physicians are so focused on their patients, it's hard to get them to focus on themselves. What I tell them is do it for your patients. If you get burned out, you're not going to give good care to your patients. So do it for your patients. Make sure you have a reasonable life that you can do the quality of medicine you're capable of doing.
So when it comes to contracts, obviously negotiations involved, and physicians just really aren't versed in negotiation. It's just not really part of their medical training. So when it comes to physicians who have to negotiate with the hospital system, what kind of tips and advice can you give them?
Well, first of all, realize how valuable you are. What I see all the time with fellows is they look around and they see 20 other people that are just as well qualified as they are, and they think it's some kind of competition. There's such a shortage in this country right now of physicians. You have to realize how valuable you are and how hard it would be to replace you. It's shocking to me that the training physicians have and the value that they bring, they really don't seem to have a very high opinion of their own net worth and what they bring to the hospital. So I think you have to realize that you're putting hundreds of thousands of dollars on the bottom line of the hospital, and you deserve a life too. Yeah, you got to take care of your patients, and we expect you to take care of your patients, and we know you will, but at the same time, you need to have a reasonable life. And again, I don't think there's any other profession I'd have to say this to, but don't do it for yourself, do it for your patients so they get good quality care and don't have a burned out physician they're dealing with.
Over the last 5 years or so on my blog, on various physician Facebook groups, we talk a lot about physician burnout, and we tell them exactly the same thing you're telling them, that we physicians need to know their worth. And Even after all this talk, all these Kevin MD articles, all these podcasts over the last few years, have you seen the needle moved a little bit in terms of physicians valuing themselves?
Very, very, very little. I was shocked. I thought the great resignation would result in a slew of physician renegotiations, and it's not. I mean, physicians put themselves in the shoes of their patients too much. I mean, you say, well, my patients, it takes forever to come see me, so I guess I'll have to have more office hours. And at some point, as I said, you have to look out for yourself. And so, no, I'm not seeing a great movement. As I said, physicians are too concerned with their
Mhm.
patients. I know it's hard to say to a physician, but you're a person. To give good quality care, you need to take care of yourself too.
All right, let's talk about the Kevin MD article that you wrote. It's titled, Are Hospitals Evil? Physician Contract Lawyer Explains. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read your article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
On the same day, I negotiated with two different hospitals, and two different hospitals told me that when I asked for 32 patient contact hours a week, so that the physician has some time to do medical health records and so on, they explained that that was a part-time position. And as you know, a 40-hour patient contacts per week is going to be about 60 or 70 hours for a lot of physicians getting the EHR. So I was really frustrated. And then I got thinking about it, and can you really blame them? It's not like the MRI machine. The MRI machine, you have to keep the maintenance up or it'll simply break. The janitor, if you ask him to come in and work extra, he'll charge you overtime and that'll go to the bottom line. Literally, the only thing in that hospital, probably nurses too, but are physicians that you can just push them and push them. They'll keep billing, which is what you're interested in. They're not going to go home if there's patients still in the waiting room at 6. They're going to see them. The physicians are just going to do whatever has to be done to take care of their patients. So you kind of can't blame the hospital. There's really no need for them to look out for the physicians. As I said, equipment breaks, unions quit or don't do the same quality of work. Physician's going to do the very best care he can for his patient, no matter what it takes. So I think I was so frustrated about the part-time crack that's what kind of got me to sit down and write that article.
I read somewhere it costs the hospital system about $100,000 to replace a physician who leaves. Now, doesn't that factor into some of their calculations when it comes to proverbial work-life balance and how they treat physicians?
You would think it would, and at some point, I think it might. And when you usually see it happen is when you start getting a slew of resignations, or the 50-year-old physician retires, and then now the 48-year-old is talking about retiring. But you don't see it the way you would in any other. I love, they call it the workforce. It dehumanizes it nicely, but you don't see that anyplace else. And as I said, they know, but they can push those physicians as hard as they want to, and the patient care won't suffer. Nothing else will suffer. So I think that's why, yeah, you would think that 100,000 would make them think, but look at the bottom line of a hospital. I mean, it literally, we can burn out a few physicians if we spend a couple $100,000 replacing them. Yeah. And the thing is, we burn out too, we can probably push their work onto the other physicians for a good long period of time.
Mhm.
So it just isn't, you can make so much money off of the physicians. I don't think $100,000 just strikes them as an unreasonable expense to keep grinding.
I had another physician executive on the show, Pat Fahey, a couple of months ago, and she talked about something called the business school mindset. And I don't want to misquote her. I think she said something like the business school mindset takes a dim view of humanity. How much of that business school mindset do these administrators really have, and how much does that business school mindset drive their decision making?
Well, I think it completely. I mean, they're business people. They talk about we're in the quality of care, but I'm an executive that happens to work for a hospital that happens to treat sick people. But I'm an executive. I've got a budget. I will do better. My bonus will be based on me maintaining my budget. So they're just driven into a business mindset. I don't, and you can't blame them. I mean, I don't know of any hospital executives that get any kind of incentive for patient care. or quality of life of the physicians. It comes down to money. So we found an area where we can squeeze really hard. Why shouldn't I? It's my bonus at risk. So yeah, it absolutely is a business mindset. These people are MBAs and they're in a big enterprise that's billing sometimes billions of dollars. It's a business for them.
So in this environment where you have new physicians coming out of residency looking for jobs and even physicians leaving one job and going to another, we talked about this earlier. What are some ways where physicians can push back? And you mentioned about physicians, they need to know their worth, but let's put that in practice in a negotiation setting. How does that exactly look like?
I think you have to say, look, I'm working 60 or 70 hours a week, and I'm not willing to do that anymore. I am willing to work more than most people do. And of course, I'll still do call and go sleepless nights and all that. But I need to have reasonable patient contact hours. You need to spend the money to hire a locum tenens because I'm not doing more call than this number from now on. And they're looking at, well, we can start recruiting. And it's not just money. It's also usually a lot of physician and executive time involved to, meeting with these people and making sure. And there's always a question when they're interviewing. I mean, they know you're well qualified. If you're coming out of, if you're ready to become a physician in this country, you're well qualified. We know that. But all they know really is that you can go 15 minutes without being a jerk in an interview when they're hiring a new physician. Mm-hmm. Whereas you've been there a while, they know you're getting along with the staff, the patients love you, you're a known quantity. That's worth an awful lot too. So I usually just say, first of all, I should be paid more. I should be paid for excess call. I should be paid. Let's look at MGMA. I at least need to get paid that. I should get productivity compensation, and there's quality of life issues that we must address. And again, I tell physicians, do it for your patients, don't do it for you, because I know you'll just keep taking it for your patients, but you can't.
So if one of your physician clients says all that and tells you to negotiate with the hospital with that mindset, in general, how flexible are the hospitals when you present them with that scenario?
They can be, and it depends obviously on the physician. There's some specialties that are extremely hard to replace and are putting an awful lot of money on the bottom line. They're generally fairly flexible. Now, if MGMA says X dollars is the median, they can probably go over that. They're not going to pay you twice MGMA median, and they can't. Various laws prevent them. So they're not going to give you outrageous money. But at the same time, they can give you benchmarks kind of money. There are benchmarks for excess call that they can pay. And I find that they're fairly reasonable. Even things like a reasonable assignment. I've had physicians that have been there for 10 years and they've been assigned to one hospital. Nobody's going to move them, but their contract says we can move you anywhere in the system. And we may have hospitals 70 miles away. Now that's the kind of thing, it doesn't hurt them to say, yeah, we'll agree that we won't assign that position any place other than, X hospital. So those kind of things, a lot of times a physician says, I don't care, I trust the CEO, but nowadays that CEO can be gone next week. Mm-hmm. And you can get, Chainsaw Al coming in. And so you can't ever say they've been reasonable on this. I think you have to look at everything in the contract and assume that at some point somebody may push it. So as I said, there's a lot of things that may not even have an impact. But to me, I would sleep better knowing that they can't send me to that hospital 75 miles away, even though my current contract says they can.
We're talking to Dennis Hursh. He's a physician contract lawyer, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, Are Hospitals Evil? A Physician Contract Lawyer Explains. Dennis, you touched upon a couple of points in a typical contract that physicians should be aware of, patient contact hours, for instance. What are some other overlooked areas that physicians should be aware of when negotiating contracts?
Call coverage. New physicians, a huge issue to worry about is start date. You move into town, maybe you signed a mortgage or at least you're renting property. And a lot of these contracts say if you're not credentialed with absolutely every managed care company, we can terminate the contract or we can just push back your start date. So there ought to be reasonable provisions in there that would allow you to negotiate. If there's one, now if you're a geriatrician and you're not credentialed with Medicare, that's a big problem. But if you're not credentialed with one company, usually they can schedule patients with other companies. If one hospital hasn't credentialed you, the other physicians could probably admit patients, maybe do rounds for a little bit of time. So that's something I see a lot of new physicians caught in. As I said, malpractice tail coverage is another one, and the restrictive covenant is one. I see hospitalists that are asked to sign a restrictive covenant. Now, I'm sorry, you can be the greatest hospitalist that ever walked on the face of the earth, but I don't really think you're going to take any patients away if you move to another hospital. So the restrictive covenant should be reasonable. It should be based on where you're seeing patients, not every location that the health system has. And when you change, it should be based on where you are, not every location that your new health system has an office. So those are the things that I see people getting tripped up on most.
Regarding restrictive covenants, I hear conflicting information on this, of whether they could actually be enforced by hospital systems. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, true story I have in my book. I represented a very senior physician, very active in the medical society, a specialist. So wherever he went, he would have a lot of referrals day one because a lot of people knew him. Before I represented him, he signed a contract that had a 65-mile restrictive covenant. He was looking at a hospital 63 miles away. The general counsel of the new hospital and I talked. We both agreed the other hospital would be crazy to bring that lawsuit because all their restrictive covenants for all their physicians would get thrown out if it was tossed. We literally said there's no way a court's going to enforce this. The bottom line is they hired somebody else because they thought about it, and we may win, but we don't want to go to court. We don't want to tangle with that other health system. If there's a possibility of a lawsuit, we want to avoid it. So physicians have to realize that the market will enforce a restrictive covenant that a court never would.
And when physicians start looking for contract attorneys, what are some of the things that they should be looking out for?
Well, I think somebody that's done a lot of it, not, I'll stop my dog bite case and take a look at your contract. And also really somebody that has a lot of experience on physician contracts. There's things in this industry, if you will, that nobody else has. In no other industry would you have to carefully make sure that there's no way anybody could construe that you were getting payment for a referral. And the Stark regulations I keep in my desk drawer, but they're about that thick. They're about 3 inches thick. So you need somebody that can make sure you don't run afoul. And I've actually done contracts for, it was a small health system, and I'm quite certain that the contract violated Stark. I had to go back and say, talk to your lawyer about that, because Stark had changed recently. So I think you want somebody that with experience in, certainly in employment contracts, but preferably with contracts with physicians.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Well, I think you have to take care of yourself. And even if you're not doing it for yourself, even if you don't, and this is harsh, but if you don't care about your family, if you don't care what you're doing to your health, your patient care is going to suffer if you are not getting enough sleep, if you are totally burned out. So take care of yourself so that you can take care of patients and get a fair contract. Make sure your contract doesn't allow them to push you around.
And Dennis, how can people reach you?
Well, my website is pahealthlaw.com, physicianagreementshealthlaw.com. That's probably the easy place. My phone number is 866-DOC-LAW-1. And my email is dennis@pahealthlaw.
Dennis, thank you so much for sharing your insight. Appreciate you being on the show.
Great. It was a pleasure.